Yes. 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 Right. Great. Yes. Please take your seats. Okay, we're going to get started. Can we get out of your way?
Thank you, everybody. This is going to be informal. The first course is served. You may begin. Do not wait. Get started. Ambassador Yamamoto will give us a chance to get through this salad course, and when we serve the main course, then he'll get up and give us some remarks. The courses will be served as you're finishing. Please be seated. Carry on amongst yourselves, and we'll interrupt you again in just a few moments. May I have your attention, please? Do keep on with your meal. We're not going to stop, but our keynote speaker is on a pretty tight schedule, so we're going to have to go ahead and begin our program. So try to keep the talking amongst yourselves to a low ebb, but continue eating. He informs me he doesn't mind a little clanking out there. But to introduce our keynote speaker, I want to invite Ambassador Sanders up again.
Thank you, everyone, and I hope you do enjoy the lunch. We had a great session this morning, and it will be continued, I know, by wonderful remarks from Ambassador Don Yamamoto, the Acting Assistant Secretary of State of the Bureau of African Affairs at the State Department. I'm not going to go into the details of his bio, except to say that not only did he have a distinguished career as the ambassador to Ethiopia at a very, very challenging time, but he also has the distinction of having served twice as the Principal Assistant Secretary of State for Africa in the Bureau of African Affairs, and that is a distinction that no one else has, and it's a testament to not only his kindness, but certainly his policy and diplomatic skills. And in addition, in the essence of full disclosure, he was also my boss when I was ambassador to the Republic of Congo. So we had two, I think, pillars today. What's at stake for Africa? What's at stake for China? And I think we're going to look to Ambassador Yamamoto to tell us from the U.S. government perspective how he sees those two things and the key pillars and what you can all do as either NGO leaders, civil society leaders, business leaders, academic leaders. Please, can you join me in welcoming to the podium Ambassador Don Yamamoto?
Yeah, I have this problem. It's kind of, Thank God my son is taller than me now. It's not my daughter, but so please kind of just go on, eat, and clang away. It's great. It's like a Chinese restaurant. So I just want to kind of give a couple of footnotes before I start into the speech, but. My experience with China goes back 20 years ago when I was a human rights officer in Tiananmen Square, and it was really a great time and also a terrible time. But it kind of gives you a sense of what our relationship is with China. On the one hand, it's very creative, it's innovative, its people are very nimble, they're dynamic. On the other hand, there's the issue of governance, democracy issues. The other thing, too, is to keep in the back of your mind as we talk about on our speech today is how much resources we're going to have in the next few years for the U.S. government. And it's going to be, the notes are going to be struck this March when we have the debt ceiling debate. And we're kind of looking at, looking at how much money that we're going to have. And it's really our budgeting is kind of going down the line. We have $6.8 billion in U.S. assistance to Africa this year, and we're looking at a cut. And really over the next several years, we're looking at more cuts. And so how are we going to tackle all the things we need to do in Africa, yet at the same time expand? We have 53 embassies and consulates in Africa, and we're going to expand to 55. We're not going to go down, we're going to expand, even in a budget tightness, because we need to be in places where Robin was telling us, in Kano, Nigeria. We need to be there. We need to be in Mombasa. We need to be in Guinea-Bissau again. And so those are areas that we're looking at. And so how are we going to tackle, and this brings back to some of the things that our speakers have said, and that is we're looking at how to promote and expand American influence and also integration with our African colleagues and others in the African continent. And so in the last year, we've embarked on 6 unfunded mandates. And I know David would love this. Unfunded because there's no money attached to it. But they're mandates that underscore the importance we attach to Africa and to the region. And most of them are on trade and investment. How do you promote trade and investment? How do you create that vitalism? The next thing, too, is we're not just talking to China. We talk to China every year. and every month and every day probably. But we also talk to Brazil, we're talking to India, we're talking and continuing with China, Korea, Japan, as well as our European colleagues. And then we're talking to our African partners in a much more in-depth discussion. And thanks to Robin and her team, we're doing Nigeria, Angola, South Africa, the African Union. We're talking to the Ethiopians and then other regional states, ECOWAS, SADC, IGAD, and EAC. And so those are kind of some of the things I want to say before this speech, and then I'll kind of refer to these points. And really it's kind of a very humbling experience to speak before you today with so many great speakers that you've already heard. And I'll just try to add my 2 humble words on this. And I want to thank Mr. McDonald and, of course, Ambassador Sanders and all the other distinguished guests here today. What I want to do is to kind of briefly discuss with you what U.S. policy in total is towards China. And in that context of U.S. policy towards Africa, raise some of the possibilities of how the United States and China can and must cooperate in order to contribute to the benefit of Africa and towards meeting our respective strategic goals and objectives. The United States does not see China as an adversary nor as a new Cold War opponent. The United States sees China as an important player in the world facing with us the same economic crisis, political changes, and challenges to global development and stability. The state visit of Hu Jintao to Washington last month underscores the importance the United States attaches to China, as well as our strong desire to engage China in a comprehensive manner which will promote better bilateral understanding and mutual cooperation. We have many shared interests with China, and we must highlight and build on those interests to expand our mutual understanding and cooperation. But we also have differences. We also have misunderstandings and misperceptions of each other, and we need to overcome them and resolve them. And there will be some differences we can't overcome, but we need to learn how to deal with them in a very cooperative manner. Misunderstandings and misperceptions are fueled by uninformed speculation. On one side, you have China's economic growth threatens Asia's economic stability, threatens the United States' economic and political power and authority, and will lead to a hostile Cold War-like scenario. In China, there are those who fear that the United States seeks to contain China's rise in the world economy and politics and dampen Chinese growth and stifle Chinese national pride. Secretary Clinton stated on January 14th that these are wrong, and we reject these views totally and completely. This is the application of 19th century theories to 21st century issues. We are all in uncharted territory, an international landscape marked by emerging centers of influence and by non-traditional and non-state actors that presents unprecedented challenges and opportunities. The Secretary referred to a Chinese proverb when she stated that we are all in the same boat, and when you're in the same boat, you must row in the same direction. If we do not, we will either row in the same direction or we will, unfortunately, cause turmoil and whirlpools that will impact not just on our 2 countries, but on many of the people we seek to engage with, and that goes beyond our borders. For our own bilateral relationship, as well as for the future and that of Asia and the world, we must find ways that we, the United States and China, cooperate and coordinate and overcome any misunderstandings and misperceptions and resolve those differences that we have. The Secretary outlined 3 approaches to China, which is the hallmark of this administration. First, we must enhance regional engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. This entails security agreements as well as economic and political networks to promote free trade agreements, create opportunities for U.S. firms, and make the U.S. an important player in Asia. Second, we must build bilateral trust with China. This is being promoted through interagency dialogues with China, and I just want to note that during the visit of the chief of the military staff of China, I had the opportunity to brief the general on African issues. And this is something new, it's innovative, and it's something that we're going to dialogue at all levels with our Chinese colleagues at every visit and meeting. Third, We must expand our working relationship to address challenges such as the global recession, nuclear proliferation, terrorism, piracy, North Korea's nuclear ballistic missile program, the six-party talks on stability and peace on the Korean Peninsula, and Iran's nuclear program. Closer ties with China will also help U.S. firms which have a $50 billion investment in China. This will help correct some of the significant trade imbalances we have between the United States and China, which now our two-way trade exceeds $400 billion. But the content of that trade is imbalanced. China exports 3 times more to the U.S. than it imports from the U.S. And though China's GDP is only 1/3 that of the United States, China's economic expansion is significant at 10.3% per annum. Now, our policy of engagement and finding common ground on shared goals and objectives is also being pursued around the world. And in Africa, that is really being pursued in a very aggressive and very positive and I think a very productive manner. President Obama said in Ghana last year, our 5 pillars, and for David, it's different pillars, but let me just kind of outline, reiterate once again that the President articulated that what we seek to advance in Africa is democracy, good governance, governments that are accountable to the people. Why? Is because the people of Africa want it. And therefore, we need to listen to what the people of Africa are telling us and in partnership address those needs. Second, we're looking to growth, economic growth and development. The other 3 pillars we're looking at conflict mitigation, healthcare, education, transnational issues such as climate change, drug trafficking, and terrorism. China's objectives in Africa correlate in many ways with what we're trying to achieve. Despite occasional differences and some fundamental differences, we believe it is important that our 2 governments remain engaged, and that is going to be the hallmark of this administration. We are constantly looking for ways to overcome differences, enhance cooperation, so we can better support Africa's development. Back in 2006, when I was working in the front office, we looked at how we could establish regular bilateral discussions with China on African issues. And from those first discussions, we initiated our first annual discussions, and we're now heading to our 4th consecutive year of close discussions with China on African issues. Last July, here in Washington, we hosted a delegation headed by Vice Foreign Minister Jai Jun. Our discussions were conducted on a wide range of issues, and I must say they were probably the most successful discussions conducted outside of our Asia Bureau. As we saw in President Obama and Secretary Clinton's visit to China, Africa is held up as an example of how the United States and China can cooperate on shared interests. And from now on, every visit to China, and the Secretary is going off to China again, Africa will be an issue, front, fore, and center. In addition to these bilateral discussions, we confer regularly with our counterparts at the Chinese embassies here in Washington, and our approach has been to demonstrate that through greater cooperation on a wide range of issues affecting Africa, China can meet its responsibility as a Security Council member in the UN, while also meeting its economic goals. We have also instructed our missions around Africa to reach out to their Chinese colleagues to discuss areas of cooperation, to assess China's role in their respective countries, and to see where we can overcome differences, but more important is to help point China and to work with China on a positive, cooperative relationship to the benefit of Africa. As we all know, trade and investment are central to Africa in the China story. As China's overall trade with Africa exceeded $100 billion last year, and that was about, I guess you said 85%, it's about 85 to 89% of all African imports by China consist in oil, minerals, and raw materials. With our Chinese counterparts, we are discussing how to diversify that trade, and we have encouraged programs modeled after what Fleur Lizer has done on AGOA and on other issues that USAID is trying to expand on African industrialization. A more diversified trade with Africa that extends beyond raw materials will not only help Africa, but also expand the opportunities for China. In Ethiopia, for instance, we introduced to our Chinese colleagues to what we're doing in Ethiopia and Kenya and other parts of Africa is commercialized farms managed by our USAID program. These farms are intended to help African farmers increase yield, focus on specific exports to earn foreign exchange, develop better agricultural techniques, and become more familiar with overseas markets. Chinese visits to these farms have led to discussions on how China might contribute to help better increase yields and increase exports. And China sees such cooperation in its national interests because of its potential to meet its growing agricultural needs. And I'll give you one example is we helped Ethiopia produce probably one of the world's best, highest quality soybean. Yet instead of going to the United States, it's going to China, as well as to Korea, but mostly all to China. So your tax dollars are helping produce and promote agricultural production in Ethiopia for the benefit of China. So in one of our discussions at the bilateral discussions last year, Jai Jun noted that China is able to meet the basic food needs of its 3 billion people, even though it has arable land less than what is in the DRC, which can't meet its food needs for 71 million people. His delegation outlined the requirements for increasing agricultural productivity, land reform, elimination of tariff and non-tariff trade barriers, and improvement in infrastructure, telecommunications, insurance, and banking. These are issues and views that we share, and I think we can have a commonality in addressing these problems. And one of the issues that Fleur Lizer has raised from USTR constantly is that interstate trade in Africa is 10%. Well, if you look at NAFTA and the EU, it's over 95, 97%. And so how can we increase and improve? And as I know, Fleury and USTR is always saying that if you increase Africa's world trade by just 1%, you will produce $70 billion in trade growth, which is nearly 3 times more than the total amount of foreign assistance or investments to Africa. Another discussion that we had with China last July centered on some very difficult issues and challenging topics that we are going to have to address together, not only as China, but also with our African partners. And one of the issues was exploitation of timber and minerals in Africa. Contrary to what might have been expected, this was not a contentious issue, but it's an issue that raised discussions on how we can and must address it. For one thing, and kind of let me take off from my notes, when I dealt in China as an economic and political officer in China, when we dealt with Asia, that was a very tough discussion because China looked at Asia as this area of influence and as this solid point for development, and that the United States was in many ways looked on as an interloper. But when it comes to Africa, where they don't have that kind of emotional attachment, Africa is looked much more on a business and economic terms. But we want to shape the Chinese viewpoint is that it's not just economic. What's good for business means democracy. What's good for business is economic development. What's good for business is helping our African partners develop and trade where they can create jobs and have an ability and stability and a basis for trade expansion. That's good for business. And that's an issue that we've been discussing with the Chinese. In both of our countries, both the United States and China, look to see how we can, in a more rational and long-term resource management policies, create areas where would be benefit to the communities in Africa. Otherwise, mineral deposits will become prematurely depleted, and also forests will be denuded. With our Chinese counterparts, we have also discussed Africa's security needs. We have raised our concerns about arms sales of China to Zimbabwe, to Sudan, and other regimes that have problematic human rights records. These are undoubtedly a cause for concerns also for the Chinese. Rather than dwelling solely on these issues, however, we have discussed ways in which affordable Chinese arms and military equipment can be used to outfit reformed militaries in countries where democratic values are taking root, which will create stability and greater expansion of trade and investment in Africa. The Department of State we have partnerships with 24 African countries. We've trained in the last 10 years 36 African battalions. That's 120,000 African troops. Among those, 70,000 of those troops remain in peacekeeping operations, and 33,000 are in UN operations. That's probably one of the best records of all training programs around the world. China can play a very helpful role, not only in supporting the African Union in contributing to security of Africa, but through the support for capacity building and peacekeeping and peacemaking operations. Its participation in peacekeeping operations in Sudan has been noteworthy, as well as participation in other peacekeeping operations in Africa. The next area is health and education. And here are two areas which has really a great potential for cooperation and where we are making some progress on the African continent. For example, Africa continues to suffer from a dearth of healthcare professionals, a problem exacerbated by the ongoing brain drain. I want to give you another example from my experience in Ethiopia. We did a survey. There are 2,500 Ethiopian doctors. There are 2,600 Ethiopian doctors in this area. And so we're looking at it and saying, well, what can we do? We discussed with our Chinese, our Japanese, our European colleagues, and what we came up with is rapid basic healthcare providers based on the EMT training program in the United States. What the Chinese came up with is kind of like going back to the Cultural Revolution, the barefoot doctors, of rapid training of doctors or healthcare providers who can go into the hinterlands so they can provide basic healthcare for the people of Ethiopia. And that's what we're doing. And under Minister Tedros, who's probably one of the most innovative African healthcare leaders, has done a tremendous job in making this truly a dynamic and successful program in Africa. Given all that we've learned from its own history, China can also be helpful in moderating the behavior of some of African leaders who have clung to old-moded authoritarian and economic policies. I want to give you an example that has been the bane of David and I's issue is Eritrea. When I was in Eritrea, one of the issues that we noticed is that the President, Isaias, and the Eritreans remain enamored with China's Cultural Revolution, a period in China's history which is what they want to forget. During my tour in Eritrea, President Isaias, during a dinner party, said to me, you know, the Cultural Revolution was really a great time. And we said, why? And he said, because Mao Zedong created order. You had order. I said, yeah, but it created a lot of death, a lot of pain. And he says, but it was order. And one of the things during the Ethiopia-Eritrea border dispute, I used to go off to see the president. This is really off the record, even though it's on the blog. And he used to order Chinese food from the Chinese embassy. And he would read everything on Mao Zedong. And he's probably the greatest expert on Mao Zedong. But as our Chinese ambassador to Eritrea said, no, that's not China. What China is the modernization started by Deng Xiaoping and now is realized by Hu Jintao. That's China. It's not Mao Zedong. Not surprisingly, there are many other areas where our objectives do not always converge, but there are sharp differences. For example, one of our discussions last July focused on how to promote basic industrial production in Africa in sectors such as leather, textiles, and handicrafts, in an area to advance industrialization and diversification of productivity in Africa. This topic did not appear to attract the Chinese interest, but we will continue to raise it because it's important to trade, and ultimately it will be important to China in those trade relations. The other thing, too, that we raised, which is a concern for us, and I think a growing interest in China is the use of concessionary loan packages and other packages, which has raising the indebtedness of Africa at a time when we in the United States went out of our way to work with our African partners to eliminate debt through the HIPAA process. And what we're seeing through the Chinese aid packages, but also from India and other issues, is the re-indebtedness of some African states. Well, we're also looking at the Chinese state industries, which are directed and supported by the Chinese government and their Chinese embassies, which promote monopolistic contracts in key sectors. And what we want to do is expand and have a diversity of competition because that's good for business. In all our discussions with China, what we've done is to promote free market approach as the best solution to Africa's development challenges. Duplicating the Asia model in Africa, as some African leaders have advocated, will be challenging, but possible. And one of the issues that we have discussed with Prime Minister Melvin and President Museveni and all the other leaders in Africa is that if we look at the China model, we're going to have not a China model, but we need an Africa model, a model that suits Africa needs. And so what worked for China is they had high rates of savings, they had high rates of academic performance, they had infrastructure, they had low corruption rates, and they had really good systematic approaches towards industrial trade. But Africa has other issues, has other benefits, has other benefits that can meet Africa's needs. What we need to do is we need to understand that better, and through our contacts with the Chinese and other communities is to learn how to take advantage of it. We've advocated technology transfers, greater use of local workers and trainings and capability and capacity building. And that's an area that we've really tried to work with our Chinese colleagues, that you can't bring Chinese workers to Zambia to build roads. What you need to do is build on Africa capacity. That's what's going to build the capacity. And I'll give you one example. We have 15 new American embassies built in Africa. We're going to build 15 more. We use almost exclusively African workers. Why? It's because A, there's a thirst to learn, there's a thirst to develop capacity. And one of the things that I've learned in my 3 years in Ethiopia of jackhammers and construction is that over the 3 years of construction, the African workers were great. They were superb. All they needed was the training and the direction. And now what we've created in these 15 countries where we have new embassies is a more dynamic construction atmosphere. It's higher quality, better worker safety, quality of materials, and also protection of worker rights and salary benefits. Because if you have happy workers and family members, you'll have higher productivity. Another area that I just want to conclude is our area that is going to be continuing, that is democracy and good governance. We believe that democratic values and having governments accountable to the people will ultimately be the area in which will help promote trade, investment, development, and also stability. We've asked the Chinese embassies to join with us in donor group meetings, etc. And for the first time, they are participating. China is now participating in donor group meetings throughout the continent. They may not advocate or support a lot of the findings, but at least we have them in those meetings, and that's important. Those engagements, the first steps. And so despite our lingering differences, our discussions on Africa are becoming more complex, addressing a wide range of issues. And my Africa Bureau colleagues know that discussions with our Chinese counterparts have become increasingly productive, in-depth, and expansive. And so we look to our Chinese interlocutors who are willing to engage through talks rather than to defer discussions to later dates or for further research. And so in areas of China, in areas of Africa, we are noticing that at least there, the China-U.S. relationship is becoming much more dynamic than I've seen in other parts during my 30 years in the Foreign Service. And so with that, I want to end and to thank all of you because I learned a great deal from listening to all the other speakers today as well. Thank you very much.
Time for a couple of questions.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Ambassador Yamamoto has graciously given us a few more minutes of his time for some questions. So we will do that. Are we going to have microphones? Just a moment. Here they come. Mel, and then, okay, right there.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your great remarks, and I thought they were right on the mark. My question has to do with all the current instabilities going on in the Middle East. We know what's happening in Tunisia and Egypt. We're looking across the whole Arab region. It seemed to me that the oil issue might become a problem for us there, which might mean that Africa's oil might be even more important than it is today. Do you see potential conflict in terms of China, in terms of competition for African oil?
Yeah. You know, it's up to our partners in Africa. They're going to determine how Africa is going to dispense with its energy needs and its productivity. And that's what we're trying to do, is give them those opportunities. As you know, the biggest oil finds right now are off Chile, but also off of Ghana in the Jubilee oil fields and off Lake Albert in Uganda. And so what we're trying to do is, I know that Angola now is the #1 supplier of oil to China, but if you look at the trend of imports from the United States from Africa, David Shin really was on the mark. It's 20%, 25%, 30%. It's going to expand and develop. And so what we need to do is look at how we can balance those oil monies in those countries so that it helps those countries develop, where you don't have a situation where a country with oil needs is poorer than a country that doesn't have oil. And so how do you use those funds responsibly and for the benefit of the people and for the region? And that's really the fundamental issues that we need to work at and to discuss. And that's the topic we discussed last July, was China. And let me just kind of do one footnote, and that is the Chinese are very practical. If it's good for business, then they're going to do it. So we can demonstrate that this is good for business, they're going to do it. And so this is what we're going to produce. So Mel, you're absolutely correct. This is going to be not only area for competition, there's going to be competition, but also I think there's going to be areas for cooperation. And we can't forget the interests of our African partners. We can't.
Bernadette. Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador Yamamoto. It's good to see you. You said that there probably will be cuts in foreign assistance to Africa from the United States. And while we heard all morning about China's increased engagement and investment in the continent of Africa, for us to have these cuts right now, how would that, first of all, impede those plans that you spoke of? And secondly, what is the State Department's strategy and the administration's strategy for educating members of Congress so that they realize that this could have an impact on not only our economic interests, but our security interests as well? Thank you.
Well, we have Alice Pearl Marsh here, so this is great. The carrier of the day, but and that's it. We're reaching out to the members of Congress and selling our story. You know, when we were in Ethiopia, we had a delegation from New Orleans saying, "How much money do we give to Ethiopia?" I said, $1 billion. And they said, "Dang, we need that money in New Orleans. We got people still living in trailers. If we can't sell to the American people and to those members of Congress why Africa matters to them, then we fail." You know what we're doing now is we're going out to the heartland of America. I mean, I spend now every 2 months, besides Africa, I go to Minneapolis, I go to Seattle, we're going to Alabama, Mississippi, we're in North Carolina. We're going to the heartland of America to give our story of what's important. And that's really kind of a dynamic change. Going to your yes, it is going to be difficult if we have budget cuts. How are we going to address those? The answer is we're going to have to do a lot of things that are kind of out-of-the-box thinking. And one area that we're looking at is, thanks to Ambassador Perry and CCA, and also the AmCham, is that, you know, we have 5 American chambers in Africa. You know, we got that many in one portion of China. We need to get American chambers in every country in Africa. We need to look at how we can dynamize, bring in American investments and interests in Africa. And so those are things that we're looking at, trying to do things differently and innovatively and creatively. And then bringing in a lot of American interest. You know, I was talking to Boeing Aircraft the other day when I was in Seattle. I'm from Seattle. And they said, you know, we got to sell 280 more airplanes on the African continent. That's one of our growth areas. Africa is probably the fastest increasing, rising economy in the world. I mean, yes, it's number 3 overall, but I think in the next years it's going to be dynamic, and we need to be there. We cannot allow other countries to be there. We need to be there first and foremost. And so from what we heard from the speakers today is that if we don't do something dynamic and great now, then we're going to be left behind in the dust. And so that's why we're actively working, through your help too, to be working with our African partners on trade and investment and expanding and getting our message out to the African people as well.
Okay, we're going to take one more question, and the first hand I saw was right here.
Okay. Just harping on the diaspora outreach again, I want to say something very specific, just making a little plea for this. When you look at the role of development all over the world, especially in China, China has more foreign trade zones than anywhere in the world. So when you look at the role that foreign trade zones have played in development, it's done a specific thing. It has helped diasporan investors to overcome the set of circumstances they need to overcome in order to feel comfortable with that investment. So what the foreign trade zone regime represents in a special economic zone is different from in the CAFTA countries in Central America and in Africa. So one thing that happened with the World Bank and the multilateral development institutions is that they concluded that foreign trade zones were a macroeconomic distortion. And so therefore, they don't have them. So I'm saying now, as you're talking about innovative strategies, in order to harness the African diaspora investment, we need to do some surveys, focus groups with them, see what kind of features foreign trade zones should have to attract them, and then promote the building of them with the multilateral development bank money. That is a role that the State Department can do. The money doesn't have to come from you, but as an advocate of this for development, it would matter.
And that's why I have all your name cards, and we're going to be contacting you. Especially.
Okay, Don.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to let Don actually eat now, and then he's going to have to go. Dessert will be served, so everybody stay in their place. What we're going to do now is as we're finishing our meal, I think Robin, maybe you and Stan can come up a bit later and take some more questions from the panels. Then we can pass the microphones to panelists if a question is directed at them. But let's take a few moments for Don to finish eating and for dessert to be served before we start that.